Welcome to another edition of Stretchers, Scandals, and Unsubstantiated Scuttlebutt, our series looking at the myths and legends about biblical characters and biblical events. As we jump into this next edition, I think it's important for us to remember that these are not Bible stories. These are stories about Bible stories. These are stories that have developed over the centuries about the characters and events in Scripture that fill in the gaps about people we don't know much about, or events that aren't really detailed for us. So last week we learned a little bit about the disciple Thomas and his interesting adventures going to the east and building a magnificent palace for a king. Of course, it wasn't not an earthly palace, but a heavenly palace. And at the end of that story, we talked about the fact that it precluded him from following up on another task he had hoped to do. And that's the story I want us to look at today. But first, we have to take just a quick moment to think about one particular question. I'd like for you to take a moment to think and to see if you can name all 12 disciples. If you want to pause the video and give it a try, you can, but see if you can name all 12 disciples. It's a little trickier than it maybe sounds. Some of them we know really well, but others we don't. And in fact, depending on which book you look at, there's a slightly different name for one of the disciples. So we know some of them very well, but some of them have sort of faded into obscurity. So who are the 12 disciples? Peter, Andrew, James and John, Philip, Thomas, Matthew, Bartholomew, James, Simon, and Thaddeus. Now, Thaddeus is the one that we're going to talk about today. You'll notice that I said James twice. There are actually two disciples named James. There's James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, and then another James who's a little bit younger. But Thaddeus is the interesting figure for us today. You see, depending on which gospel you look in, you may find a different name for Thaddeus. Matthew and Mark call him Thaddeus, but Luke, both in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts, Luke calls him Jude or Judas. And so sometimes he's called Thaddeus, sometimes, big gust of wind there, sometimes he's called Judas. We typically prefer the name Jude for obvious reasons. We want to avoid the confusion with the other Judas. And occasionally in church tradition, he's called Lebbeus. And then to add to the confusion, Thaddeus is sometimes spelled with an A-E in the middle, and sometimes it's just an E. So you get Thaddeus with an A, Thaddeus without an A, Lebbeus, Jude, or Judas. This disciple gets 5 different names. No wonder we have a hard time remembering him in our list. Thaddeus is a strange one. But before we scratch our heads too much about that, just to sort of as an example, think about how many people you know that have more than one name. I mean, if you know somebody named Elizabeth, they could be called Elizabeth, or Beth, or Betty, or Liz, or Lizzie, or even Eliza. There's so many different names, and each of those seems very different. And there's William with Will, Bill, Billy, or Willie. There's so many different names deriving from the same one. This is a little bit different, but I think it's important for us to remember that we can have more than one name for the same person. Well, so the story of Thaddeus is that Thaddeus and Thomas were talking, and they had, after the resurrection, they remembered a request they had been given right during Holy Week. The story goes that to the north, in an area that we would call today, we know as Turkey, there was a king, and the king's name was Abgarus. Abgarus had come to hear the stories about Jesus, and he had through this sort of through the traveling of stories and through hearing the hearsay, Abgarus had come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God, even though he had never seen Jesus. And so Abgarus, he found himself kind of a follower of Christ, and he desperately wanted to meet Jesus. But that desire intensified when he got sick. Abgarus got very, very sick, and he believed that Jesus could heal him. And so the story goes that around Holy Week, this king in the north sent a letter to Jesus. Now, there are a lot of different versions of the story, and some of them get very strange, but we're going to just kind of stick with the most simple version. He sent a letter to Jesus, asking Jesus to come visit him and heal him. But during Holy Week, Jesus was kind of occupied and in fact imprisoned, and so he wasn't able to go visit Obgris. He may have never even received the letter, but the story goes that Thaddeus and Thomas saw this request. And after the resurrection, after the ascension, they were trying to sort of tie up loose ends, and Thomas decided he was going to go visit the king in the north. But then he began to feel that he was called not to go north, but to go east. And he was afraid that they were going to miss this opportunity to speak to this king in the north. So he turned to his fellow disciple Thaddeus and said, "Thaddeus, can you go north? I'm going to go east. Can you go north and meet with this king?" And Thaddeus was willing to do so, and he began traveling north to find the king. But as he did so, every town he came to and every time he stopped, he found that there were people in need, and there were people who needed healing or needed to be fed, or people who needed to hear the gospel. And it took Thaddeus a very long time to travel north, and he found that he wasn't really making much progress. Well, as Thaddeus began to heal and as he began to preach, word of this preacher, word of this miracle worker, began to travel faster than Thaddeus traveled, and eventually the king heard that there was a miracle worker who was slowly moving his way north. And rather than waiting to see if Thaddeus would come visit him, the king actually sent his own messengers to go and get Thaddeus and bring him to the palace. And so these messengers came to Thaddeus, and they told him that the king was hoping to speak with him. And Thaddeus said he was willing. In fact, this was his entire point, was trying to get to visit the king. And so when they brought Thaddeus to the palace and opened the doors, Thaddeus was shocked to find that the palace was packed. There were all the nobles, all the king's advisors, all the most wealthy and influential people, and anyone who could cram themselves into the palace. They were all there to see this miracle worker, to see this preacher. And he came up, and he was about to bow to the king, when instead the king fell down and bowed before Thaddeus and said, "Are you truly a servant of the risen Jesus Christ?" And Thaddeus said, "I am, and that's why I'm here." And they had a conversation. And Thaddeus, seeing the king was still bowing in front of him, Thaddeus stretched out his hand and touched the king. And as he did so, as we saw so many times in the Gospels, when Thaddeus touched the king was healed. And the king stood and said that this is what I knew was going to happen. This is why I summoned you. I wanted to receive healing, but even more than that, I wanted to hear more about this Jesus. I've only heard little stories, bits and pieces. Can you please tell me more about who this Jesus is and what he wants me to do with my life? And Thaddeus began to preach, and he looked around and he saw that he had a packed congregation, and he preached not only to the king but to all the nobles and all the people in the palace. And as they all heard him, so many of the people of the king's family and his household and his servants, they all converted and they were baptized. And Thaddeus preached the gospel, and he changed so many lives in that moment, all because of the king who wanted to hear more about Jesus. Is this story true? There's no way to know. There's so many versions of the story, but one of the really interesting things about it is this king who already knew stories about Jesus, he just wanted to hear more. And as he sought to hear more, it impacted not only the king, but the people all around him. And it changed the life of Thaddeus as well. There's something really healthy about studying our faith and about telling the stories of Jesus Christ. What a wonderful story and a wonderful way to learn more and more about who we are and who God's calling us to be. Well, of course, there are so many more stories about so many more myths and legends in Scripture, but we're going to have to save those for another day.